In today's lesson, we are going to be learning about carbohydrates. As always, I recommend that you please watch this video on either your phone or a computer so that way you can follow along and take notes. In this unit, we are going to be discussing three different macromolecules. One of them is going to be carbohydrates, another is going to be fats, and the last one is going to be proteins. One thing to keep in mind with carbohydrates, they are an organic molecule composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. One way that you can remember this is if you think about carbohydrate and break that apart, we have carbo, which stands for your carbon here, and then hydrate. Well, if you think about hydrating something, that makes you think of water, and water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Carbohydrates will have this generic formula of CxH2xOx. So an example of this would be glucose. And with glucose you have C6, and notice H12 here because you have 2X. O6 is the main source of energy in the human body. This is also often just referred to as sugar. And that is a form of a carbohydrate. So if you look at, say, a Chipotle meal here, you'll see that it has carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So you can see the total fat here is 11 grams. Carbs, it has about 40 grams of carbs, and then your proteins, I'm sorry this is crossed off, I don't remember why, but I think it's roughly 30 grams of protein. So a lot of your foods will actually contain all of these different types of macromolecules. Still focusing on carbohydrates, there are three main types of carbohydrates. There are what we call monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. And as always, it's good to look at the prefixes for these. So mono, meaning one, is a simple sugar, and that's when we have just one simple sugar molecule, which, as we saw on the last slide, is commonly C6H12O6. If we look at disaccharides, that is two simple sugar molecules covalently bonded. So now you're going to actually have two sugars bonded to each other, and a good example of this is C12H22O11. And you'll notice here, this one no longer follows this pattern of twice the hydrogens and the same amount of oxygen. So we went from 12 carbons, but now we only have 22 hydrogens and we only have 11 oxygen. And we'll look at why that is on the next slide. And then our last form is going to be a polysaccharide. Again, we've seen poly before, poly meaning many, and that is when you have three or more simple sugars bonded together. There isn't going to be a set chemical formula for this like we've seen with, the monosaccharide or disaccharide, and that's because poly is going to depend on how many sugars were bonded to one another. And here we look at how a monosaccharide and a disaccharide are related. So a monosaccharide is going to be one of these simple sugars here. Again, this is basically just a cyclohexane ring. It's just looked at from an angle. And then it has a lot of different alcohol groups on there. But that's an example of what a sugar is. And then what happens is when two monosaccharides join together, this is actually an example of our condensation reaction that we learned about. So you'll notice that the one hydrogen here and the OH from here are going to break off, and we get this H2O again, and then we are going to have our disaccharide. So that is now two sugar molecules combined. And you'll notice before, when we talked about our monosaccharide, it had a chemical formula or a molecular formula of C6H12O6, and then the disaccharide was C12H22O11. And if you look at these, you'll notice that this disaccharide here has just lost this water. And so that's the difference between these two. Their number of carbons didn't change, but this water comes off, and so that's why instead of being C12H24O12, this has just lost this water molecule over here. And that is why it's still called a condensation reaction. The reverse of this, however, is if we started with a disaccharide and we added water into it, you can actually split that apart and get two monosaccharides. The reverse of a condensation reaction is going to be called hydrolysis. And really quick, here's an example of a polysaccharide. Again, poly meaning many, saccharide, so many sugars joined. And here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sugars joined together, and this is actually an example of starch. So far we have talked about mono, di, and polysaccharides. So one thing I do want to point out is that a disaccharide is not necessarily two monosaccharides joined together. The way that it works is a disaccharide is something that follows the generic formula of CX, H2X, OX, and then you subtract an H2O off of it. So let's look at an example down here. If we have C7H14O7, that would be a monosaccharide. And the reason this is a monosaccharide is because it follows this generic formula, where we have CX, so C7, H2X, so H14, and then O7, so we have that 7 there again. Now the disaccharide version of that is if we took this and we subtracted H2O off of there, you'll notice we get this disaccharide, which is C7H12O6. And then a generic definition of carbohydrates is that they are sugar polymers, or some sort of carbohydrate plus water. And again, that's why we have this formula down here of CN, H2ON, or you can substitute the N through, so you would end up with CH2NON. And sometimes that's a little bit easier just for finding like your disaccharides and everything. So a lot of us have heard about carbohydrates and how they provide energy. If you've ever heard of somebody who's going to run, say, a marathon or some sort of race, they will often carbo load. And that is because carbohydrates provide us a lot of energy. And the way that they do that is, so fast energy is something that is a reliable source of energy. And those are like your simple sugars. So if you eat a candy bar or something like that, you get energy very, very quickly. Slow energy are something that takes time to break down. Those are going to be your complex sugars or your complex carbohydrates. So a good example of that would be like your pasta. And that's what a lot of runners will carbo load on, because that will slowly release the energy because they are very, very, very long carbohydrate chains. One thing to know with carbohydrates is 1 gram of a carbohydrate is equal to 4 calories. Now, key thing with calories here is that we have this capital C. Because it actually is going to be a kilocalorie. I know it's a really confusing way to do this, but 4 calories with capital C is actually equal to 4,000 calories with a lowercase c. So we have to be very careful with that, this unit, that whenever we look at a food, it will always be talking about this capital C. So if you look at food and it said it had 4 calories in it, that is actually 4,000 calories, because this capital C technically stands for kilocalorie. And that's what this is talking about down here, is 1 capital C calorie is equal to 1,000 kilocalorie, or is equal to a kilocalorie, which is 1,000 calories. And then 1 calorie, lowercase c, is equal to 4.18 joules of energy. So a lot of us have heard about fibers. Fibers are basically just indigestible carbohydrates, and the reason for that is the body can't absorb it. So a lot of your fibers actually don't have any calories because they're indigestible. Your body doesn't have a way to break that down. So therefore they provide no calories because they're basically just going to pass through you. Something that is high fiber is going to be a low calorie food, so your fruits and your vegetables. And a lot of us have heard of that. If you're ever constipated or anything, you need to eat a lot of fiber in your diet because it's just going to basically pass right through you. And then laxatives are the more common term that we've heard of with, we'll say, helping to clear you out. So 2 different types of those. There's Metamucil, which is loaded. They just have tons and tons and tons of fiber, which help to wipe the system clean. And no fiber at all, which, well, that can lead to explosive results. So another application of carbohydrates is lactose. Lactose is sugar that is commonly found in dairy products and a lot more. So if you've ever heard of somebody who is lactose intolerant, what that means is they're lacking this, basically the lactose enzyme And you can think of an enzyme as kind of like the key, so it's what knows how to break apart those lactose sugar molecules. So if somebody is lactose intolerant, they're lacking this enzyme that knows how to break apart the sugar molecule that is found in milk. And then there's also what's called high fructose corn syrup. 42 or 55% fructose, and the remaining is glucose. So high fructose corn syrup just means there's a lot of the fructose sugar in there, and common source of this are your soft drinks, juices, white bread, so on. And they're believed to promote obesity because, again, they are not dissolved all that well by the body, so the body's not going to know how to break those apart. They're not going to leave you, and your body is just eventually going to turn them into fat as a way to store that energy. Tomorrow we'll be starting our lab on carbohydrates. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use what's called an indicator. And the indicator you worked with before is when we did the titration lab. And that's where you added a couple drops of this, and as you added your base you noticed the reaction turned pink. Well, we're going to do an indicator lab for carbohydrates that are going to help us determine mono, di, and polysaccharides. And we'll look at different foods that contain these types of saccharides in there.